Welcome to an episode of Too Close to Home, the series where we dig up creepy stories, haunted places and mysteries from our very own Patreons' hometowns. Because it's the Creepy Marathon month, this episode is dedicated to the paranormal tales in the hometowns of Joseph, Nesh, Ali, Josh and Deborah. And do we have some good stories in store for you five? If you want us to dig up stories from your area, then head on over to Patreon and join our Too Close to Home tier. Thank you everyone for supporting us. And now, Joseph, Panesh, Ali, Josh and Deborah, as well as everyone else, hit those lights, sit back and enjoy. Blackpool is a large seaside resort on the northwest coast of England. It's famous for its theme park and tower ballroom, but it also has its fair share of ghosts, and our patron Joseph has asked us to see what we can dig up. First we'll take a look at the Carlton Crematorium. The Carlton Cemetery is situated near Carlton Village in Blackpool. It opened in 1936, and not long after, the Blackpool Evening Gazette caused a stir when it ran a first-hand account of a ghost at the cemetery. It claimed that the taxi driver Henry Hodges had seen the face and body of a green-looking spirit at the gates to the graveyard, while on a cold December night, Harry picked up a lady outside North Shore Station at around 11 o'clock. The lady asked him to take her to Robin's Lane in Carlton. Harry took the quickest route he knew, but just as he was about to turn right into Robin's Lane, his passenger asked him to turn left instead. Harry was puzzled as the road led to the crematorium gates, but the woman insisted, so he carried on driving. He pulled up just in front of the gates and waited whilst the woman found her purse to pay him, but as he turned to take the money, he looked out of the car's side window and found himself staring into the face of an old man with sunken eyes, long dark hair, a punch-like nose and prominent chin. His shock was compounded by an ear-splitting scream for his passenger sat behind him. The next minute, the woman was clambering out of the cab and running off into the darkness down a path to the left of the crematorium gates. Harry continued to watch in horror as the ghostly face moved around to the front of his cab before disappearing. Harry was concerned for his passenger and quickly manoeuvred his cab so that the headlights illuminated the path she had taken, but there was no sign of her. The next day, Harry was still trying to make sense of what happened and decided to call the local newspaper, hoping that other people might come forward and give him a logical explanation for what he had seen and help him track down the woman who would corroborate his story. But no one came forward, despite the newspaper reporter asking house to house if anyone knew anything. The only thing that came to light was that 5 years earlier in the Robins Lane area, a woman was beaten to death. Could the woman who got into the cab have anything to do with that murder? Or more chillingly, was she the spirit of the murdered woman coming face to face again with the ghost of her attacker at the cemetery? Next up we have Frenchman's Cove. Frenchman's Cove is a restaurant located on South King Street, close to Blackpool's main shopping centre. But it's not just a nice meal you'll get served there, it also has a resident ghost. The female ghost is thought to be a young girl called Laura Scoons from Scarborough, who used to work in the building when it was a tobacco warehouse. It seems she loved the place so much, she returned in death to scare the punters. Staff at the restaurant have long been plagued by the feeling that someone is keeping an eye on them. At night the cellar is particularly creepy, and some have even claimed to have witnessed the full-body apparition of Laura's ghost. During renovations to the restaurant, contractors who worked on the cellar reportedly told the owner they felt very uneasy in the area, as if someone was watching their every move, a feeling a lot of people have experienced at the restaurant. Have you ever been, Joseph? And if so, did you experience anything? Nesh. Nesh lives in sunny Brisbane in the Australian state of Queensland. Brisbane is one of the oldest cities in Australia, and with age comes history, and with history comes ghosts. We will first look at Bogo Road Jail. Bogo Road Jail Dutton Park was once the largest, most notorious prison in Queensland. It hung 42 of its inmates for a variety of heinous crimes, and nowadays the jail is renowned as being the place of nightmares, full of discontented spirits who still linger in their former home. The most well-known of these is Ernest Austin, who was the last person to be executed at Bogo Road Jail after he was convicted of the rape and murder of 11-year-old Ivy Mitchell. It is said that as the noose was put around his neck, he laughed at the executioner, totally unremorseful for his crime. After his death, he was buried in unconsecrated ground in South Brisbane Cemetery. However, in a final act of defiance, it is said Ernest returned to the jail in spirit form, and whilst the prison was still in operation, Ernest was known to put his unseen hands around inmates' necks in an attempt to strangle them. He has also been seen gliding through walls and is particularly active on stormy nights, with his demonic laughter echoing throughout the jail. Today, the former jail is a tourist attraction and a magnet to paranormal investigators, all trying to catch a glimpse of the infamous Ernest Austin. Jack the Ripper's grave. Could Brisbane be the final resting place for the world's most infamous serial killer, Jack the Ripper? While rumours have long persisted that Jack was Walter Thomas Porriott, also known as Andrew John Gibson, who lived in London when all 5 murders were committed. Porriott sailed to Australia hours after Mary Jane Kelly, the Ripper's final victim, was found mutilated. Porriott was a convicted killer, fraudster and imposter who allegedly married 20 times, and the Ripper murders abruptly stopped when he moved to Australia. Even his own great-grandson claimed in 1997 that he was in little doubt his great-grandfather was Jack the Ripper. Whatever the truth is, Walter Porriott is buried amid family shame beneath his faithful last wife, Eliza Bessie Porriott, on a hill in Brisbane's Toowong Cemetery. However, in 2012, when Porriott was mentioned as a suspect, his grave was vandalised, and some believe it was the work of devil worshippers trying to contact Jack's spirit. Toowong Cemetery is already known to be haunted by several spirits, so could the ghost of Jack the Ripper be among them? Goodna General Cemetery. Another graveyard in Brisbane said to have a supernatural presence is Goodna General Cemetery, and the ancient cemetery is said to be seriously creepy and full of paranormal activity. It opened in 1859, and many of the early burials were infants who were buried in tiny graves with just their surname recorded. One terrified visitor was forced to stay at the cemetery overnight after his car refused to move, even though the engine started. He slept in his car overnight, and when the sun rose the next morning, miraculously his car moved and he quickly drove back home. But when he later inspected his car, it seems he had a very lucky escape, as either side of the car there were deep scratches as if someone or something had been clawing at his car during the night. Others who have ventured into the old part of the cemetery have been left covered in bruises and scratches made by an unseen force. Some believe that this is because, in the mid-1940s, corpses from Brisbane Mental Hospital Cemetery were exhumed and reburied in Goodna. And over the next 4 years, thousands of bodies were dug up from the asylum cemetery and reinterred in unmarked graves at Goodna, although only 200 were recorded and no records exist to show exactly where the patients were buried, so their exact place of burial remains a mystery. More than 55 years after the remains of the patients were moved, the original cemetery grave markers from the hospital cemetery were used to establish a memorial to all those who died at the hospital. They now serve as a haunting reminder of how mentally ill people were treated back then. However, not all the patients at the hospital were innocent members of the public. Some of them had committed heinous crimes, and it's thought that the ghosts of these former murderers roamed the cemetery, confused, disgruntled, and angry. After all, disturbing the dead is never a good thing, but disturbing the criminally insane adds a whole different level of terror. Livingston, West Lothian. Livingston is the largest town in West Lothian, Scotland, and is the hometown of Ali. Scotland is known for its larger cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow, but despite Livingston being tiny in comparison, it still has a lot of history and a lot of paranormal activity. Let's take a look at a few places for you, Ali, starting with the House of Binns, a 17th century house located in West Lothian. It dates back to the early 17th century and was once occupied by Commander-in-Chief of the King's forces in Scotland, Sir Thomas Deal, otherwise known as the notorious Bloody Tam or the Muscovite Devil. Following his death in 1685, there have been numerous reports that the Muscovite Devil haunts the house and grounds, earning the estate a reputation as Scotland's most haunted place to visit. Tam's ghost makes his appearance felt in a variety of ways, both inside and on the grounds of the house. His boots have been seen walking around the house by themselves, and outside, he has been seen galloping across the lawns on his white stallion. Tam is known to have a cruel and bloody past, and imprisoned thousands of Covenanters in open-air prisons on starvation rations. He was also said to have thrown women in jail with wild animals and wiped out entire families without trial. Tam also had a taste for torture instruments and was known to crush prisoners' limbs using a gruesome device known as the boot. It's no surprise that legends put Tam in league with the devil, and he is famously said to have played cards with Satan himself at the House of Bins. The story tells that one night, Tam cheated at a game of cards, and the devil furiously picked up a marble table and threw it out the window. The table was thought missing until almost 2 centuries later, when it was found at the bottom of Sergeant's Pond, on the estate grounds in summer of 1878. One distinctive feature on the table is said to be proof of the legend of Tam and the devil, which describes a satanic hoof mark seared into the table. Next up, we have Bangor Village Hospital. Bangor Village Hospital, near Dechmont in West Lothian, is a place Ali has asked us to look at, as she herself has had a creepy experience there. The abandoned asylum was one of Britain's first villa-style psychiatric hospitals, but since closing down in 2004, it is now a relic of its former past, and its crumbling walls and eerie empty corridors leave a chilling impression. The site is now a magnet for ghost hunters and urban explorers. The hospital opened in 1906 for Edinburgh's lunatic paupers, and over the years it was home to some of the most disturbed individuals in Scotland. It was also used in the First and Second World Wars as a military hospital. When it closed down, it was discovered that 566 patients had been buried in unmarked graves in nearby cemeteries, and the whole area has the reputation as being haunted by the spirits of deceased patients. One former hospital employee who worked there in the 1980s described it as a sinister place to live, and was filled with shell-shocked veterans of the First World War. He said Ward 9 was most likely the one ward that gained an awful reputation for being haunted, where strange things did indeed happen, with voices, moving furniture, and doors closing and pushing against you. Take a look at this video from YouTuber Teen Z, where possible EVP was caught. That shows you just how creepy this place is. After the last patients left the hospital in 2004, the building was used to film the psychological thriller film The Jacket. Lastly, let's take a look at the Robert Taylor incident. We couldn't talk about Livingston without mentioning one of Scotland's most famous UFO incidents. On November 9, 1979, forestry worker Robert Taylor parked his pickup truck at the side of a road near the M8 motorway near Livingston, and walked along a wooden path up the side of Dechmont Law with his dog, where he saw what he described as a flying dome, or a large circular sphere approximately 7 yards in diameter, hovering above the forest floor in a clearing about 530 yards away from his truck. He said the object was a dark metallic material with a rough texture like sandpaper, featuring an outer rim set with small propellers. Taylor also reported smelling a foul odour like burning brakes, and that smaller spheres similar to sea mines grabbed him and dragged him in the direction of the larger object when he lost consciousness. When he later awoke, the objects were gone, but he could not start his truck, so he walked back to his home in Livingston. When he arrived home, he was muddy and dishevelled, and his clothes were torn. His wife called the police, and the doctor treated him for chin and thigh grazes. Police later escorted Taylor to the site, and they found ladder-shaped marks in the ground, at the spot where Taylor said he saw the large spherical object, and the smaller mine-like objects. Police recorded the matter as a criminal assault, and to this day it remains the only example of an alien sighting becoming the subject of a criminal investigation. The story drew a lot of attention from ufologists, and a plaque was erected at the site of the alleged encounter. Over the years, many have tried to disprove Taylor's claims, but have not been able to come up with a plausible explanation, and the Robert Taylor incident is believed by many to be one of the few genuine cases of a UFO encounter. We hope you enjoyed, Ali. Stafford in Staffordshire. Staffordshire is a market town and the county town of Staffordshire in the West Midlands region of England. It is also home to Josh, one of our much appreciated patrons. Stafford dates back to around 900 to 700 BC and has a rich and varied history, including a collection of very old haunted buildings. First, we'll take a look at the ancient High House. The ancient High House has been a dominant feature of Stafford's skyline for over a century. The house was originally built in 1595, and in past lives has been a residential home, a Civil War prison for officers, a school, and home to a unique shop. Today it's a museum. However, one constant in its history is the rumour that it's haunted. Staff and visitors have reported many incidents over the years, with the most common being the heavy oak doors opening and closing by themselves on the top floors. One notable incident was witnessed by a member of staff and was followed by a sighting of a tall black apparition in the doorway. The Victorian room on the second floor is said to be the most active, with sightings of an old lady sitting in the rocking chair and a young girl in Victorian dress standing in the middle of the room. The temperature of this room is always cool, even when the heating is on. However, perhaps the most well-known sighting was in the 1960s, when a party of American visitors claimed to have been guided around the house by the resident shopkeeper, but when they returned the next day with friends, they discovered the house they had looked around the day before was an uninhabitable ruin. When shown a picture of the late William Marson, who had shops within the house in the late 1890s, the Americans claimed that he was the guide who'd showed them around the previous day. Next up we have the Swan Hotel. Once a coaching inn, this 400-year-old Stafford hotel has witnessed a lot of history, with stories of mysterious tunnels linking its vast cellars with St. Mary's Church and Stafford Castle. Allegedly, a lot of paranormal activity surrounding the hotel involves a former drowning pool on the grounds that was used to kill women charged with witchcraft. It is said that these innocent women whose lives were cut short in a horrific way still linger around the hotel. There is also a priest hall built at the time of the Jacobite Rebellion, and when it was excavated during renovations, bottles and bones were found, believed to be the remnants of its last desperate occupant. In the older part of the building, there are stories of a female ghost who was regularly seen in the 1940s and 50s. It is thought the same ghost, known as the White Lady, is also responsible for an incident in the 1970s, when the hotel manager woke one night to see her standing over his bed. She has also been seen walking the corridors, and one live-in chef became so creeped out by her presence that he couldn't stand it anymore and quit. Lastly, we have Weston Hall. Weston Hall is another impressive 16th century building, repurposed as a hotel and restaurant that is perched ominously on a hill, looking out over the stunning Staffordshire countryside. However, it has a grim past, as for many years it was used as a paupers' lunatic asylum, taking overspill patients from St. George's County Asylum in Stafford. During the Second World War, it was requisitioned by the army, but the Auxiliary Territory servicewomen were so spooked out by the place that they chose to sleep in tents rather than inside the house. One of the most frequent ghost sightings is that of a grey lady who walks around the hall. She was so scary that workmen carrying out maintenance at the hall refused to go alone into the building. When the hall was converted into a hotel in 1996, within days of opening, it was discovered that the bar area had been mysteriously cleaned each morning with no cleaning staff on duty. This was doubly strange as the alarms were on throughout, and staff have experienced a variety of unexplained events, including whispering in their ears when no one is around, and an unknown voice calling them by their name. Both piano music of an old-fashioned and pleasant nature and the sound of carriages, horses and footmen on gravel outside of the hotel has also been clearly heard in the early hours of the morning by staff and guests. We'd love to know, Josh, have you ever been? And if not, maybe you can add it to the list and let us know your experience. The River Wards of Philadelphia and Cocoa Beach, Florida. Debbie grew up in the River Wards of Philadelphia, but now lives in Cocoa Beach, Florida, so for you, Debbie, we'll take a look at both areas. Firstly, let's start on Washington Square. Washington Square in Philadelphia is the prettiest of the 5 public parks designed by Philadelphia founder William Penn, and today it is a popular destination for visitors to relax. However, few people realize that Washington Square is built on top of a graveyard. In the 1700s, the land beneath the square was a potter's field, or pauper's graveyard, and the last resting place for many African Americans, suicide victims, prisoners of war, and those who died of yellow fever or other diseases. It is also thought more than 2,000 soldiers are buried there. although despite this slightly disturbing fact, it is not any of their spirits that haunt the square, but rather a Quaker woman named Leah, who in life was devoted to keeping the ground safe from body snatchers. Back in the late 1700s, doctors used to snatch bodies from the area to use for their lectures and experiments, and Leah would make regular visits to the graveyard at night to protect the graves of the dead, and to scare off any doctors attempting to dig up the corpses. The reason Washington Square was developed in the first place was to try and prevent more body snatching from occurring. Rather than moving the hundreds of bodies, they instead put sidewalks and trees up. At night, Leah is said to still haunt the grounds, keeping the bodies that are still there safe. Debbie asked us to check out Ashley's at Rockledge, Cocoa Beach, Florida, and after doing some research we can see why. The place is teeming with tragedy, death and paranormal activity. Nowadays, Ashley's is a restaurant located near Cocoa Beach in Florida, and is noticeable for its distinct Tudor-style architecture. The building was built in the 1930s and was originally called Jack's Tavern. It was known then as a classy joint, where the men wore coattails and the women their finest dresses. Over the years, it's changed ownership and name several times, and as you would expect, it has seen its fair share of drama, so it's no surprise that it's reputed to be haunted. The most prominent spirit is thought to be that of 19-year-old Ethel Ellen, who at the age of 19 was murdered in or near Jack's Tavern in the 1930s. Her killer was never brought to justice, but many years later, a psychic who investigated Ashley's had a vision of Ethel being murdered there. At the time of her murder, it was reported that Ethel got in with the wrong crowd, possibly gangster types, and was potentially caught up in the wrong sort of love affair. Ethel's remains were found mutilated and burned on the shores of the Indian River, and Jack's Tavern was the last place she was seen alive. Some say Ethel met her violent end in the bathroom of the tavern, and her spirit likes to tease the staff in the ladies' room. One staff member was in the stall when she noticed the shoes of the woman in the stall next to her. The shoes and stockings resembled the 1930s style foot attire, boot-like shape with buttons and high heels. When the staff members came out, the stall was suddenly empty. Another staff member was exiting the bathroom when she found the door was being pushed shut by an unknown force. She thought a fellow member of staff was playing tricks, but when the door finally opened, there was no one there. Others have caught a glimpse of a 1930s attire lady in the reflection of the mirrors, whilst others have heard blood-curdling screams coming from inside the building, sometimes so loud that the police have been alerted. Perhaps the most terrifying thing that has happened at Ashley's restaurant is the choking sensation some customers have felt as they walk down the hall and stairs that leads to both the male and female bathrooms. This is also attributed to Ethel, whose spirit is reliving how she died, and a dubious picture of her floating down the stairs, allegedly snapped by a paranormal investigator, is hanging on the stairs. Other spirits said to haunt the bar are the entity of a little boy thought to have been killed on the nearby train tracks. Another story tells of a man being dragged by police down the stairs of Ashley's in the 1940s, while the man's autistic daughter watched on crying. It is said that she ran out into the road in her distress and was killed by a car, and since then has haunted the stairs and the hallway, using the area to play and dance. The entity of an older man, thought to be a former long-time employee, also makes his presence felt by placing his icy hands on the backs and shoulders of staff and visitors. He is thought to be responsible for the whispering heard in the bar areas, and the lights and TV flickering or turning on and off by themselves. It is possible he is also responsible for straightening the pictures up on the staircase. There is also the ghost of a younger man, possibly either the victim of an accident or maybe the violent killer of poor Ethel. He is a particularly malevolent spirit who is known to shove waitresses from behind, almost causing them to fall, and causing the choking sensation that has been reported by both guests and staff. When he is around, a sense of doom is felt, and often things get broken in the kitchen or inexplicably get moved or flung around. It certainly sounds like a fun place to visit and work. We'd love to know if you've had any experiences or visited any of these locations, Debbie. And that goes for all the 5 patrons we've mentioned in this video. Once again, we'd like to say a massive thank you to Joseph, Nesh, Ali, Josh, and Debbie. Without the continued Patreon support, we would not be able to keep up everything we do. If you'd like your hometown featured in an episode of Too Close to Home, check out Patreon for more information. Thanks for watching, we hope you're enjoying the Creepy Marathon month, and as always, we'll see you right back here tomorrow for another scary video.